Welcome to part 2 of our video about economics. Last time we talked about some of the basics of economics, including some basic terminology like goods and services, needs and wants, supply and demand. We're going to go into more in depth with some economic background here, including a little bit about the history of the field. Some major types of world economies. There are 3 broad types and then the mixed type. So the 3 broad types are a traditional economy. This is the economy used in traditional based societies. This means that trades are done with barter. So, for example, someone might trade, you know, 10 chickens for a goat. Someone might trade a bushel of apples in exchange for a newly woven blanket. Barter still certainly occurs in the economy today. But in a traditional economy, currency is not used at all, or is maybe only used by very, very, very few people, the elite of the elite. In a command economy, the government makes decisions regarding all economic aspects, certainly at the macroeconomic level and even at the microeconomic level in many cases. The government decides what is going to be produced by factories and what is going to be grown on farms. The government sets prices and the government sets wages. In a free market or capitalist economy, the market makes decisions regarding production prices and wages. So, by the market, we mean the overall group of all the buyers and all the sellers in the economy. Most economies are mixed, they are a combination of those things. The US, for example, has a mixed economy. Now, the US is usually considered a capitalist country if it has a free market economy. Why am I saying that it's actually a mixed economy? Because there are things where the government does make decisions. There are, for example, minimum wages set by federal law, and for most states, or for many states, also set by state law. Those are government decisions about wages. Um, the government has business regulations in place. The government, for example, bans monopolies. In a true free market economy, a monopoly would not be something the government would get involved in because the theory is that if a monopoly hurts consumers by, for example, raising prices, then a competitor will emerge. So, although the US is accurately described as having a capitalist economy in everyday speech, we need to keep in mind for our purposes it really has a mixed economy. If you were to ask, if you had to choose between free market between free market or command, it certainly has a free market economy. But in reality, it's a mixed, a combination economy. I do want to mention entrepreneurship. Um, Entrepreneurship is at the individual level. This is part of microeconomics. This involves individuals, excuse me, individuals who start businesses. This involves risk, of course. Most businesses fail that are started by entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are usually self-employed. They traditionally work very long hours, and they make very little compensation, especially considered the hours that they work initially. Obviously, there is the potential to make a lot of money from entrepreneurship. But at the short term, often that is not the case. And entrepreneurs, especially initially, while they're sort of that entrepreneurial stage, that individual has more responsibilities than employees, right? An entrepreneurial organization, that entrepreneur is responsible for, for making ideas, for sending them out, maybe for doing marketing, for doing public relations, for managing the employees that they might have, and so on. All right, moving back to broad economics at the macroeconomics level, I want to mention mercantilism. So I mentioned today we talked about 3 major types of world economies. Mercantilism um, was an older idea that actually kind of maybe also merged what we today might call a command economy and to an extent a free market economy. In mercantilism, economics was seen as what should benefit countries. So the point of economics should be to benefit the nation. And imports were seen as bad, particularly. Countries should be self sufficient. Now, exports were also potentially bad, but they weren't as bad as imports. Ideally, all trade should occur within the country. And this was the dominant form of economics in the 1600s, the 1700s. This is during the US colonial period. And in fact, mercantilism is one of the reasons why European countries colonized in the 15, 16, and 1700s, because it was the dominant economic theory. And the idea was that colonies around the world would provide raw materials that the home country lacked, whether that home country was England or France or Spain or the Netherlands or Sweden, or later Japan. Um, that might be lumber, it might be grain, it might be iron ore, whatever raw materials that the country might need. Those would be shipped to the ruling country, to the home country, to the mother country, as they called themselves at the time. And in that country, not in the colonies, the raw materials were made into finished goods. Those finished goods were sold within that country and within that country's colonies. And colonies were often forbidden from manufacturing. This did lead to smuggling in times, um, because this is very economically inefficient. It is very inefficient to, grow, especially at the time, to grow cotton in the Western Hemisphere and ship it to England to be woven into cloth. Does not a good use of resources, particularly. Mercantilism really did not work well. In that period, in the 18th century, comes Adam Smith, a Scottish economist. And Adam Smith is credited for popularizing and or creating the idea of laissez-faire, which is French for leave it alone, let it be. It is Adam Smith who argued what I just said a few minutes ago was the fundamental idea of capitalism, which is that markets will self-regulate. He called this the invisible hand. The invisible hand of the market. You don't need the government setting prices. The um, the markets will do it. If prices are too high, new competition will arise. That will lower prices because competition lowers prices. If prices are too low, inefficient producers will go out of business. This is, again, the foundation of capitalism. His main work, his best known work, is called The Wealth of Nations. It actually has a much longer title than that. Works in the 19th century tended to have very long titles. Another interesting figure from this time period is Thomas Malthus, who is an English philosopher and economist in the late 18th century and early 19th century. And Malthus argued that population would increase faster than food supply. We talk sometimes in science classes about carrying capacity, the idea that a piece of land can only support so many organisms. We talk about this with deer, for example, or with rabbits, or with wolves, or with bears, or with ladybugs, whatever it may be. Maybe not so much for insects, but for mammals, certainly. Um, that a certain amount of land, a certain number of acres of land, can only support so many dozens or hundreds or thousands of an animal because there's a limited amount of food, of water, of shelter, of whatever resources that animal might need. And so we talk a lot about carrying capacity, and we see this in the natural world that when the population of a certain animal type increases too much, that population then ends up dropping dramatically eventually because of things like disease or famine. And Malthus argued the same was true in Earth. Now, when Malthus was living, there were around 1 billion people in the world. And he argued that Earth's carrying capacity would limit the world's population, that only a certain number of people would survive on Earth, and that the carrying capacity meant that when population got too high, natural, either natural reactions or reactions caused by the high population would limit that population. So natural reactions are things like famines, diseases, natural disasters. War would also happen as countries fought over scarce resources. Now, Malthus, I think, would be shocked to learn that there are 8 billion people on Earth today. And he would also be shocked, as one of the globalization videos that I asked you to watch a few weeks ago noted that although many people live in poverty, that is true, that number has also declined over the years. The conditions for many people are much better than they were when Malthus lived. And that's because of a variety of things. But what Malthus didn't take into account, and you can't blame him because it was something that was really occurring during his lifetime, he wasn't necessarily completely aware of, is the impact of technology. And we know that things like advances in medicine and advances in agriculture, such as the so-called Green Revolution or the second agricultural revolution of the middle 20th century, are some of the reasons why life expectancy is so much higher. For example, excuse me. Another economic philosophy that is well known is communism. And communism was developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century. They co wrote the Communist Manifesto. And essentially, the Communist Manifesto argued that workers should own the means of production, such as farms and especially factories. In practice, in communist countries, the government normally owns the means of production. Communism is a classic example of a command economy where the government makes decisions about what is produced. That means both produced in factories and grown on farms, what wages are earned, and what prices are set as. Communism is sometimes conflated with socialism. Those are not the same thing. In socialism, there is some government ownership of industries, but government does not own all industries. Often, the industries owned are industries that are seen as particularly important to the national interests. That might include things like mining, um, other energy production like oil production or oil refining, oil extraction, power production, stuff like that. There are also in socialist economies some attempts to redistribute wealth. Now, in a communist economy, the government would completely redistribute wealth theoretically, where everyone would have the exact same amount. And we saw this in the Soviet Union, for example, where wages were set and you earned that wage no matter what. And what that often meant is that people realized that they would earn so many rubles and it didn't matter how hard or how unhard they worked. And so if you are not going to ever be rewarded for working hard, many people chose not to. They did the least necessary. And that was one of many reasons why the Soviet economy eventually crumbled. So in socialism, we aren't trying that complete redistribution of wealth, or they aren't, I shouldn't say, not we, they, but there is some via income taxes that we're going to talk about next. We have enough time, I think, to finish this part. So for income taxes, the U.S. passed the income tax nationally in the early 20th century. There was a constitutional amendment to make it constitutional. And the US has a progressive income tax, which means that tax rates increase as wealth increases. There's a lot of misconceptions about this. People think that means if you make more money, you're going to pay more taxes on all of your money. That's not true. So, by the way, progressive versus regressive. Progressive taxes here, this doesn't really have anything to do with progressive politics. It's a different sense of progressive. But a progressive tax attempts to have a similar tax burden regardless of wealth. So someone who makes $20,000 a year should not have a greater tax burden than someone who makes $200,000 a year. A regressive tax, such as sales tax, tend to fall more heavily on poorer people. Because if you make $20,000 a year and you're paying 7% sales tax on something you bought for $20, that is much more of a factor in your income than 7% sales tax on something that costs $20 for someone who makes $100,000 a year. So here are current U.S. income tax rates for single filers. I'm not trying to. I'm trying to keep this somewhat simple. In 2025, and the U.S. has 7 tax brackets I think those are still the tax brackets when I looked it up today. Um, 7 tax, and so each bracket has an increasing rate. So let's look at an example. Somebody earns $41,000 a year. Now, looking at this chart, you see, 12%, that goes with this bracket. So 11,900 to 48,400. I'm going to round a lot here. So the common misperception is, that means this person pays 12% on all their income. That is not true. That person who earns $41,000 a year pays 10% on the first $11,900. They pay 12% not on all of their income, but only the income that hasn't been taxed at 10%. So they would not pay 12% of 41,000. They would pay 10% of the first 11,900 and then 12% on the rest of the income. If that person then received a big pay raise, a 9,000 pay raise, they might worry, oh no, I'm going to the next tax bracket. They are, but they're only doing that for the amount above the upper amount of their current bracket. So with that 9,000 raise going up to 50,000 a year, they would pay still 10% on the first 11,925, 12% on the next amount, which I need to fix. Sorry about that, I forgot to subtract. And you, right now, are looking at probably the wrong screen. Let me fix that too. Hopefully you're seeing the right screen now. My screen software sometimes has issues. So they're paying 10% on just that amount in the first bracket. They are going to pay 12% on the amount in the next bracket, in the 12% bracket. The only amount they're paying that much higher tax rate, I agree, it's a big jump to go from 12% to 22%. I don't think most people would say it wasn't. But that 22% is not on the entire $50,000 they're making. It's on the amount above $48,475. So they're paying 22% not on $50,000, but on about $1,600, actually $1,524 if I added that right in my head. So progressive rates don't mean that the entire income is taxed at that new higher rate. And so when someone says, if I'm going to go in a higher tax bracket, it doesn't even make sense for me to get a raise. That is simply not true. So in this video, we took a look at some economy types: a command economy, a traditional economy, a free market economy, a mixed economy. We looked at Adam Smith and the wealth of nations and laissez-faire economics, the foundation kind of capitalism. We looked at Thomas Malthus and the idea of carrying capacity of humanity on Earth. We talked about communism and socialism, and we ended by talking about progressive income taxes. A little bit longer than I wanted this video to be, but the part 3 should be short as we finish up with some terminology and a couple of more economic theories. If you have questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.